Today I'm joined by my colleague Ken, and we're going to talk about percentage rent. So Ken, what's a short definition of percentage rent?
Well, thanks, Adrian. Look, percentage rent, or otherwise known as a turnover rent, is either an additional rent on top of your base rent or an amount that is in lieu of the base rent that is payable on a percentage of gross sales. Turnover rent is very common in shopping centres. The overall concept of turnover rent is that if the landlord supports a tenant within a centre by providing marketing and a vibrant centre, the tenant will trade well. The tenant will then enjoy the increase in sales and the landlord will receive the additional rent. To calculate turnover rent, both the landlord and tenant will agree a threshold above which turnover rent will be payable. This may be calculated by a natural threshold, which is linked to the base rent, or specific threshold amount agreed by the landlord and tenant that is not linked to the base rent. Adrian, what are the different ways within leases for calculating turnover rent?
So in most instances, a lease will contain a turnover rent percentage in the schedule of the lease. Within the body of the lease, it will then define the turnover threshold, which could be defined by these two methods, with the calculation effectively coming out the same. So if we have a look at the screen, the first option is with the turnover rent being the amount that the percentage of the tenant's gross sales exceed the amount of rent payable for that year. So the example is your turnover percentage is 10%, the annual rent payable 100,000, the annual gross sales 1.3 million. So the calculation would be the annual gross sales multiplied by the turnover percentage, which equates to 130,000. Therefore, your turnover rent over and above the base rent is 30,000. The second example being that, as you can see, the amount that the percentage of the tenant's gross sales exceed the natural threshold. So as you can see, again, the turnover percentage is 10%. The annual rent payable is 100,000. The natural threshold calculation would be dividing the base rent by the turnover percentage. So the natural threshold is then $1 million. The annual gross sales is 1.3 million, which gives you a variance of 300,000, then multiplied by 10%, and effectively you get the outcome of $30,000 as your turnover rent again.
Well, thanks, Adrian. Another question. What are some of the mistakes that tenants usually make when entering into a lease with a turnover rent calculation?
So the most common mistake is that a tenant agrees to a high turnover percentage or a low turnover threshold. Both these scenarios increase the amount of percentage rent payable and reduce the profitability of the store. Gross sales is also an interesting definition, and care needs to be made when you have a chain of stores or an online site, so that the lease doesn't require you to include sales not necessarily connected with the store. So Ken, how can a tenant leverage the current COVID situation when negotiating percentage rent?
Well, if you're in a position where you're negotiating COVID rent relief, you could request that the landlord agrees for you to pay your turnover percentage of gross sales instead of the base rent amount. If you don't have a turnover provision within your lease, agreeing on paying a percentage of turnover that you can afford can be negotiated for a period of time. If you are entering new leases, we have recently had success with landlords agreeing to the tenant only paying percentage rent at the commencement of the lease, for example, up to a period of 12 months, to allow the tenant's business to be established whilst the retail environment is recovering from the pandemic. This scenario ensures that the landlord is sharing in the risks of starting a new lease or location rather than the tenant taking on the whole risk.
LPC is well placed to help your lease negotiations with turnover rent provisions. We can provide the necessary templates and checklists so you can be best prepared for your negotiation, or alternatively, we can negotiate on your behalf. So don't put off your lease negotiations any further. Please go to lpc.com.au/subscriptions and sign up to our free subscription service and start the path towards a tenant-friendly lease. Thanks for your time.
Yep, thank you.